This is the final boarding call for Horizon National Flight 227 with service to Shreveport. All ticketed passengers should proceed immediately to Gate B7. The boarding door will be closing shortly.
The airport loudspeaker announced final boarding for Flight 227, her only flight home after 18 exhausting months. Her suitcase was packed, her resignation letter already sent, and all she had to do was walk through that gate. Then she saw an elderly man collapse face first onto the terminal floor. People stared. Some filmed, others walked away. She was just a waitress from the airport diner, a black woman who had spent the better part of 2 years pouring coffee for strangers, clearing plates in a uniform that never quite fit, and smiling through every slight because she had rent to pay and a mother to think about. Missing that flight would cost her everything, but something about the panic in his eyes made her drop her bags and run. 3 days later, she learned the old man she saved owned the entire airline. Her name was Diana Mercer, and she had spent 28 years learning what it felt like to be invisible. Not in the dramatic, theatrical sense, no one had ever called her that outright, but in the quieter, more corrosive way that certain women in certain jobs come to understand invisibility as simply the terms of their employment. She had been working at Terminal B's Blue Horizon Diner for almost 3 years before that day, arriving each shift at 5 in the morning, folding napkins before the sun fully crested the horizon, and memorizing the preferences of gate agents and flight crews who often forgot her name by the time they reached the bottom of their coffee cups. She was the one who remembered that the overweight customs officer in Gate B12 always wanted his eggs over easy, not over medium, and that the flight attendant who worked the Dallas route kept a latex allergy that the kitchen regularly forgot. She was the one who calmed down a crying toddler once, while the mother fumbled through her bag, and who quietly paid out of her own pocket for a meal when an elderly woman realized she'd been pickpocketed near baggage claim. None of these things appeared on any employee evaluation. None of them were rewarded with a raise or a commendation or even an extra break. They were simply things Diana did because she had been raised to believe that a person's character was not what they showed when someone was watching it, was what they did when no one was. Her mother, Rosalind Mercer, had said that to her more times than Diana could count, in the kitchen of their small home in Shreveport, over the scrape of a dinner fork and the low hum of the evening news. Rosalind was 63 years old and had spent her adult life as a home health aide, a profession that paid poorly and demanded everything. She was a woman who had worked through a sprained ankle, through a broken wrist, through 2 bouts of pneumonia because the people she cared for had no one else, and because Rosalind Mercer did not quit. What she had never worked through, and what now threatened to undo everything, was the diagnosis that came in early autumn of the previous year. A cardiac condition serious enough to require monitoring, medication, and the kind of stress-free environment that Rosalind's current life absolutely did not provide. Diana had learned about it over a crackling phone call, standing behind the diner in her grease-spotted apron, pressing her free hand flat against the concrete wall to keep herself upright, while her mother minimized it with the particular brand of stoic understatement that the women in their family had practiced across generations. "It's manageable," Rosalind had said. "Don't go spending money on anything foolish." Diana had spent the next 18 months spending money on nothing at all. She tracked every dollar with a precision that would have impressed a finance major. She worked double shifts when coverage gaps opened up. She sold furniture she didn't need and declined birthday dinners, and kept the thermostat lower than was comfortable through an entire winter. She had a jar on the kitchen counter with a small handwritten label that read simply, "Home," and she watched the bills accumulate inside it with the slow, maddening patience of someone who had no other option. By October, the jar held enough. Flight 227, direct to Shreveport, one way, $217 every cent of which she had earned in increments small enough to be almost insulting. The ticket was non-refundable. The airline's terms were clear. The flight left at 2:15 in the afternoon, and Diana had planned for every contingency except the one that was about to happen. She had worked her final shift that morning, handing in her apron, saying quiet goodbyes to the kitchen staff, and collecting a card signed by people whose names she'd known for years, but who had never once invited her to sit down with them at the end of a shift. Her manager, a heavy-set man named Greg, who wore the same expression whether he was approving a schedule change or announcing a death in the family, had shaken her hand and told her she was the best server he'd ever had, which Diana understood to be the first honest compliment he'd offered her in 3 years. and which she accepted with a grace she didn't fully feel. She wheeled her single large suitcase through the terminal, past the perfume kiosks and the overpriced sandwiches and the rows of charging stations where travelers sat hunched over their phones. Terminal B was busy in the way that large airports are always busy, not chaotic, exactly, but thickly populated with the particular restlessness of people who are going somewhere. Gate B7 was a 10-minute walk from the diner. She had 12 minutes before final boarding. She had timed it. She had planned everything. The loudspeaker crackled, and the gate agent's voice filled the corridor with the mechanical politeness of an announcement that did not care what it interrupted. Final boarding call for Flight 227 to Shreveport. All remaining passengers, please proceed to Gate B7 immediately. Diana Mercer tightened her grip on the suitcase handle and walked faster. She heard it before she saw it, not a scream, exactly, but a sound like the sudden absence of breath, followed by the dull percussion of a body meeting linoleum, in a way that human bodies are not designed to meet anything. She was perhaps 30 feet from Gate B7 when it happened. An elderly white man in an unremarkable gray jacket and dark trousers simply folded at the knees and went down, face first, with the boneless immediacy of someone whose body had issued an ultimatum and lost. The people around him did what crowds often do in the first seconds after something goes wrong. They froze, they looked, they formed a loose and useless ring of witness. A woman near the magazine kiosk covered her mouth with both hands. A man in a business suit took a single step backward, as if proximity to the situation might constitute a legal liability. Two teenagers near the charging station lifted their phones. A gate agent glanced over from behind her podium, paused, and then picked up an intercom receiver with the measured calm of someone following a protocol rather than responding to a crisis. The man on the floor was perhaps 70, perhaps a little older. It was difficult to tell from the angle at which he had fallen. His gray jacket was rumpled at the collar, his shoes were dark leather and well worn, and there was nothing about his appearance that announced either wealth or consequence. He looked, frankly, like any one of 1,000 travelers who passed through Terminal B on any given afternoon, unremarkable, a little tired, the kind of person you register and forget in the same breath. He was moving his hands against the floor in a slow, searching way, and his mouth was open, and his breathing, audible even from 30 feet away, was the labored, congested sound of a body working very hard to keep itself together. Diana Mercer stopped walking. She looked at the gate agent behind the podium, who was still on the intercom but had not moved from her position. She looked at the ring of onlookers, none of whom had made a move toward the man on the floor. She looked at the corridor behind her, which was now almost entirely empty. The last stragglers from her flight had already moved through the gate. She looked at the clock on the wall. 2:12. She had 3 minutes. She looked at the man. He turned his head, and for one fraction of a second, across 30 feet of linoleum and noise and the indifferent flow of an airport afternoon, his eyes found hers. They were dark and frightened, and very, very conscious. The eyes of a man who knew exactly what was happening to him and was terrified that no one was going to care. Diana set her suitcase down against the wall. She ran. She reached him in seconds and dropped to one knee, her hand going immediately to his shoulder to stop him from trying to push himself upright, which would have been the worst thing he could do. She had taken a first aid certification course 4 years ago, required by a previous employer, and had refreshed it once, since not because she had ever expected to need it, but because it had seemed like the kind of thing a responsible person ought to know. "Don't try to get up," she said, keeping her voice even and low, the way she spoke to upset children in the diner. "I've got you. Can you tell me where the pain is?" His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his color was wrong, a grayish, bloodless quality beneath the ordinary pink of his skin. The particular pallor that meant the body was redirecting resources away from the surface to somewhere more urgent. He pressed one hand to his chest, not dramatically, but with the careful precision of a man identifying the coordinates of a problem. Diana looked up sharply at the teenager still holding the phone and said, with a calm authority she didn't entirely feel, "Call 911. Right now." The teenager blinked and complied. She asked the man his name. He told her, after a moment, that it was Walter. She told him her name was Diana, and that medical help was coming, and that he needed to stay still and breathe as slowly as he could manage. She kept one hand on his shoulder and checked his pulse at the wrist. With the other it was there, but irregular, with the skipping, stuttering quality of something misfiring. She spoke to him in the continuous, calm, deliberately boring way that she had learned was effective in crisis situations. Not dramatic reassurance, but ordinary conversation, the kind that gives a panicking person something to anchor to. She asked if he was traveling alone. He managed a small nod. She asked where he was headed. He said very quietly, in a voice that cost him something to produce, "Home." She said, "Me too." She said it with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Around them, the ring of onlookers had grown. Rather than shrunk, the crash had drawn attention from across the terminal, and now there were perhaps 20 people standing at a careful distance, watching with the collective paralysis that public emergencies so often produce. No one else moved toward the man on the floor. No one knelt beside Diana. One woman asked if there was anything she could do, and Diana, without looking up, said, "Yes, clear some space so the paramedics can get through." The woman relayed this information to the crowd with an air of purpose that Diana supposed was better than nothing. The gate agent had come around from behind her podium at last and was speaking into her radio, and somewhere down the corridor there was the approaching sound of a service cart. Walter was still conscious, his eyes tracking Diana's face with an intensity that struck her as both alarming and oddly moving, the focused attention of someone who has decided that this particular human being is the thing keeping them upright and is holding on accordingly. "Why are you still here?" he asked, in that costly, effortful voice. It took her a moment to understand what he was asking. "Your flight," he said. "I heard them call it." She glanced back at gate B7. The jetway door was still open just barely. The gate agent was beginning to pull it closed, and Diana could see the last few inches of the boarding tunnel beyond. She turned back to Walter. "Because someone needed help," she said. The door swung shut. The boarding tunnel light went dark, and somewhere out on the tarmac, Flight 227 began its slow taxi away from Terminal B, carrying the seat that Diana Mercer had scrimped and saved for 18 months to purchase, carrying it south toward Shreveport without her. She watched it go through the wall of windows. At the end of the corridor, watched the white fuselage catch the afternoon light and grow small in the distance, and she did not let go of Walter's hand. The paramedics arrived in just under 4 minutes, which was fast by any reasonable standard, and felt like an eternity to Diana. They took over with the brisk, efficient authority of people who do this for a living, and Diana stepped back and let them work, answering their questions about what she had observed: the fall, the chest pressure, the irregular pulse, with the precise, sequential clarity of someone who had been paying attention when it mattered. They loaded Walter onto a gurney with the practiced ease of a team that had done this many hundreds of times. And just before they wheeled him away, Walter turned his head and looked at Diana again. And she saw in his expression something that was not quite gratitude and not quite surprise, but something in between, the look of a man recalibrating something he had previously believed to be true. She stood in the middle of the corridor after they were gone, in the sudden quiet that follows a crisis that has resolved itself, and felt the full weight of what had just happened land on her all at once. Her suitcase was still against the wall where she had left it. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 1 text message from her cousin Tamara, who was supposed to meet her at the Shreveport airport. "Running late anyway. See you soon." Sent before Tamara had any idea there was nothing to be late for. And then, 40 seconds later, a second message, this one from her Aunt Gloria, the family's unofficial dispatcher of difficult information. "Diana, your mama had a harder night. Doctor says, come soon as you can." Diana sat down on the floor beside her suitcase, right there in the middle of Terminal B, and cried with the particular silence of someone who has been holding it together for a very long time and has finally, in a corridor that no longer requires anything from her, run out of reasons to keep doing so. She allowed herself 7 minutes. Then she stood up, wiped her face on her sleeve, and went to find out what her options were. They were not good. She knew they wouldn't be had known it before she even reached the ticketing counter, but she'd had a dim, irrational hope that something might be different, that the airline might have a policy for circumstances like this, that compassion might be built into at least one small corner of the refund process. The agent at the counter was polite and genuinely sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. The ticket was non-refundable. There were no exceptions for missed flights due to medical emergencies on the ground, even when the person in question had been the one providing the emergency response. The next direct flight to Shreveport was in 3 days and would cost $480, which was approximately $200 more than Diana had left in her checking account after 18 months of near monastic financial discipline. The agent offered to put her on a wait list. Diana thanked her and walked away. Back in her apartment, a studio in a building 4 bus stops from the airport, the kind of place where you can hear your neighbor's phone conversations through the wall, and the heat comes on 20 minutes after you turn the dial, Diana sat at her kitchen table and opened her banking app. The number she saw was exactly as bad as she had expected: $83.42. She had a credit card with a $200 limit, mostly already used. She had a jar on the counter that now contained only the memory of what it had once held. She called the airline's customer service line and waited on hold for 22 minutes before explaining her situation to a representative who listened carefully, expressed genuine regret, and confirmed that there was nothing they could do. She called a second time an hour later, hoping to reach a different representative, and was told the same thing with less sympathy and a slightly faster hang-up. She put the phone down on the kitchen table and stared at it. Outside the window, a plane was climbing over the city, its lights blinking in the early dark. Not her plane, just a plane, heading somewhere she wasn't. She thought about what she had done and tried to decide how she felt about it, which was more complicated than it should have been. She had been raised to believe that doing the right thing was its own reward, and she had believed that still believed it, in the abstract. But she was also 28 years old and practically broke, and her mother was sick and getting sicker, and the space between abstract moral conviction and the actual lived consequence of acting on it was a space she was currently sitting in, alone, with $83.42. For the first time since it had happened, since she had dropped her bag and run toward a stranger, she allowed herself to wonder, quietly and without guilt, whether she had made the right choice. She didn't reach a verdict. She didn't think she was supposed to. She pulled her knees up to her chest and sat in the chair, in the way she used to sit in chairs when she was much younger. And after a while she fell asleep, because the body, mercifully, does not care very much about unresolved moral questions when it has been awake since 4 in the morning. The call came at 9 the following morning, while Diana was already in her coat and halfway to the bus stop to go back to the diner and beg Greg for her job back. The number was the same unknown one from the night before she picked it up this time, partly out of resignation and partly because she was out of choices. A man's voice, precise and professionally neutral in the way that certain men's voices are, identified himself as Edward Park, a legal representative, and said that a client of his had specifically requested her presence at Mercy General Hospital at her earliest convenience. Diana assumed it was a mistake. She told him so. He confirmed her full name, her employer as of the previous day, and the time and terminal of the incident, all of which he had correct, and said again, with the measured patience of someone accustomed to being disbelieved, that his client had asked for her specifically. Diana asked if she was in some kind of trouble. There was a pause, and then Edward Park said, "No, quite the opposite." She told him she would think about it. He said the car would be outside the diner at 11, if she wished to use it. Then he thanked her with the warm efficiency of someone ending a business call, and hung up. She thought about it for the entire bus ride to the diner, and arrived at no clear conclusion. She went inside and asked Greg for her job back, and Greg, who had apparently not yet filled the position and appeared relieved to see her, said yes before she had finished the sentence. She worked the morning rush on autopilot coffee, eggs, the customs officer's over-easy, the usual parade of faces, and at 10:55 she took off her apron, walked outside, and found the car exactly where Edward Park had said it would be. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, tasteful but unmistakably expensive, the kind of vehicle that communicates that whoever arranged it was not interested in making an impression, only in conveying that an impression was being made. The driver was a young man who opened the door without being asked and said nothing during the entire drive. Diana spent the 20 minutes in the back seat trying to decide whether this was reassuring or alarming and arrived at no conclusion on that front either. Mercy General was a large hospital in the medical district, all glass and poured concrete, the kind of building designed to communicate institutional competence rather than warmth. Edward Park was waiting for her in the lobby, a trim, well-dressed man in his mid-40s, with the contained, efficient manner of someone who handles complicated things for a living and has learned to do it without drama. He led her through 2 corridors, past a nursing station, and into an elevator without offering much beyond polite directions, which Diana appreciated more than excessive explanation. Her anxiety had settled into a low, manageable hum by the time they reached the room on the 4th floor, the kind of anxiety that you can function through if you don't look at it directly. Walter was sitting up in the hospital bed, which was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected something more dire, more machinery, more visible evidence of the catastrophe she had witnessed 24 hours earlier. He looked frail, certainly, the way people look in hospital beds regardless of their actual condition, wearing a gown that did nothing for him, and with monitors attached to his chest in the careful, methodical way of modern cardiac monitoring. But he was conscious and alert, and when Diana came through the door, his face did something that was not quite a smile, but was unmistakably a form of warmth, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific person and is relieved by their arrival. "Diana Mercer," he said. His voice was steadier than it had been on the terminal floor, though it still carried the particular careful quality of a man who has recently been reminded that the voice costs something. She said, "Walter," and sat in the chair beside his bed, because her knees had decided, somewhat independently, that sitting was preferable to standing. They were quiet for a moment, in the way that people are sometimes quiet after something significant has happened between them. Before the words exist to describe it, he asked about her journey over. She told him it was fine. He asked about her job, and she told him briefly, without self-pity, that she'd been a server at the airport diner and had worked there for 3 years. He asked about the flight she had missed. She told him even more briefly, because she was not a person who narrated her own suffering, unless asked directly about her mother, about the ticket, about the jar, about the phone call from her aunt. Walter listened in the way that certain people listen, with his full attention positioned on the subject rather than on the response he was preparing, and when she was done, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." It came out with a weight and simplicity that told her he meant it in more than one sense. It was then that the door opened, and Edward Park came back in, carrying a slim leather portfolio that he set on the small table beside the bed, without ceremony. Walter looked at Diana with the particular expression of a person who is about to say something that will require the other person to readjust the way they are understanding the conversation. "There's something I should tell you," he said, "about who I am." He paused, in the way of someone deciding how to begin. "My name is Walter Graves," he said. "I own Horizon National Airlines." Diana looked at him. She looked at the portfolio, on the table. She looked at the monitors, the hospital gown, the worn leather shoes that she could see poking out from under the sheet where they'd been set on the edge of the mattress. She looked back at his face, which was patient and unhurried, and completely sincere. "Horizon National," she said. It was not a question, but a statement of recalibration, because Horizon National Airlines was one of the 5 largest regional carriers in the country, the airline that operated the very route she had just missed, the company whose name was printed on the boarding pass that was now irrelevant in her coat pocket. She had been pouring coffee in their terminal for 3 years. She had watched their planes from the diner window during slow morning shifts. She had held the hand of the man who owned all of it, while his heartbeat stuttered on a linoleum floor, and 20 bystanders decided it wasn't their problem. "That's not why I called you here," Walter said. He seemed to understand what she was thinking. "The reason I called you here is simpler than that. You saved my life yesterday, and that's not a phrase I'm using loosely," the paramedics told me. "That the response time, the positioning, the way you kept me calm and still, genuinely mattered." He paused. "And you gave up the only flight home to your sick mother to do it? I thought you deserved to know who you were dealing with." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a plane, possibly one of his, drew a white line across the afternoon sky. "I owe you my life," Walter Graves said. What Edward Park produced from the portfolio over the next several minutes was not a single document, but a kind of mosaic, a set of records, printed and organized with the thoroughness of a man whose job is thoroughness, that collectively told a story Diana did not immediately recognize as her own. There were employee evaluations she had never seen, pulled from whatever filing system the airport maintained, each one consistently excellent in ways that her manager had apparently recorded without ever communicating to her directly. There were incident reports, small ones, the kind that get filed and forgotten for the morning. She'd stayed an extra 40 minutes to help translate for a Spanish-speaking family who were lost. 2. For the afternoon, she'd called airport security when she noticed a child alone near the gate, who turned out to have been separated from her parents by a gate change confusion. For the time, she'd quietly arranged a meal voucher for a stranded traveler who had missed a connection and had no credit card. Diana sat very still and listened to Edward Park reading these summaries in the same neutral, professional voice he used for everything, and felt something strange moving through her, not quite embarrassment, not quite pride, but the odd, dislocating sensation of hearing your own life described by someone who was not present for it and has nevertheless understood it correctly. Walter Graves had been doing this for 2 years. Edward Park explained traveling through his own terminals in ordinary clothes, without staff awareness, to observe how the people who worked for his company treated the passengers who were vulnerable. The elderly, the confused, the ones traveling alone, the ones who looked like they were having the worst day of their year. He had done this quietly, without announcement, because he had learned through decades of running a company that people trusted with their safety, that the announced inspection and the unannounced one produced entirely different results. He wanted to know what his airline actually was, not what it performed being under observation. In 2 years across 4 terminals, he had seen many things. He had seen kindness, often enough to maintain his faith in people. He had seen indifference, frequently enough to keep him honest. He had seen once a gate agent reduce a passenger to tears over a technicality and face no consequence. He had seen, twice, catering staff share their own lunch with delayed travelers who couldn't afford the terminal restaurants. And he had seen once, in Terminal B, a young black woman who worked the morning shift at the Blue Horizon Diner notice, consistently and without announcement, every person in her vicinity who needed something and find a way to give it to them, within the limits of what she had available, without making a production of it, without waiting for permission or applause. Dozens of people walked past me yesterday, Walter said. You were the only one who stopped. He paused, and in the pause, Diana heard something she hadn't expected. Not the satisfaction of a man confirming a thesis, but the quieter, more complicated feeling of a man who had been genuinely frightened. I've met people who helped me because they found out I was worth something, he continued. A lot of people, over a long career, and they helped loudly and with an eye toward what they might get in return. He looked at her directly. You helped me when you had every reason to believe I was nothing, when helping me cost you the only thing you had left to spend. He turned his head toward the window. Do you know what that's worth, Diana? She didn't answer, because she understood the question was not expecting one. Edward Park opened the portfolio to a clean page and laid it on the table between them. The first thing Walter had arranged was simple: a full reimbursement of the missed flight cost, plus the difference to cover a new ticket to Shreveport. The second thing was a charter flight, arranged for the following morning, that would take Diana directly home. No layovers, no connections, no waitlists. The medical team had cleared her mother's condition, as stable enough to allow a day's wait, Edward Park noted, as if he had verified this personally, which Diana suspected he had. She absorbed these 2 facts with the numb gratitude of someone receiving assistance who has also been awake for too long and has not yet entirely processed the morning. Then Walter said, But I didn't just bring you here for that. And the atmosphere in the room shifted in the particular way it shifts when a conversation that has been preparation becomes the thing it was preparing for. He told her what he had seen in her file, not the evaluations those she had heard, but the pattern. The composite of a person who, over 3 years in a loud and indifferent place, had demonstrated the kind of judgment that Walter Graves had spent 4 decades trying to hire and mostly failed to find. The judgment of someone who understood that service was not a transaction, but a relationship, who responded to the human need in front of them, rather than the procedure that technically applied, who did not require a manager to tell them what mattered. He had seen it in the small records Edward Park had assembled. He had felt it himself on a terminal floor. And he had been in the business of running an airline long enough to know that the culture of any company, whether it was kind or cold, whether it treated people with dignity or with disdain, was ultimately not determined by policy manuals or mission statements. It was determined by the people who worked the front line, in the difficult, unremarkable moments when no one was watching and the easy choice and the right choice were not the same. "I want to offer you something," Walter said, "and I want to be clear that it has nothing to do with gratitude or obligation or the fact that I owe you my life, although I do." He met her eyes with the level, unsentimental attention of a man who has made a great many decisions and learned to make them clearly. "I'm offering it because I think you're the kind of person my company needs. And I've been looking for evidence of that person for a long time. And yesterday you showed me in the most direct and unambiguous way possible exactly who you are." The offer was this: a fully funded management training program within Horizon National's Customer Experience Division, structured across 12 months, beginning at a salary that was more than 3 times what Diana had been making at the diner. At the end of the program, contingent on her performance, a permanent role as Customer Experience Manager for Terminal B, overseeing the staff, setting the service standards, and functioning as the human embodiment of whatever the airline wanted to be to the people who moved through it every day. Edward Park slid a single-page document across the table. The outline, the timeline, the numbers, the terms. Diana looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without speaking, which Walter seemed to understand was not reluctance, but the methodical, careful processing of a person who takes things seriously. "I don't want charity," she said. She said it without apology, with the flat, clear dignity of someone who has learned the difference between receiving help and being reduced by it. Walter nodded before she'd finished the sentence. "Good," he said. "Because that's not what I'm offering." He gestured at the document. "I'm offering you a job, based on the evidence, which is substantial, that you can do it better than anyone I currently have." He paused. "Compassion isn't charity, Diana. It's leadership. The two things you think are opposites are the same thing, in the right context." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the document. Then she looked out the window, at the sky, which was the deep, unambiguous blue of late afternoon, with a thin line of cloud near the horizon that might become weather by evening or might simply disappear. She was thinking about her mother. She was thinking about 3 years of early mornings, and over-easy eggs, and a jar on the counter that was now empty. She was thinking about a man on a terminal floor, and the 20 people who had decided it wasn't their problem, and the one person who had decided otherwise. "Okay," she said. It was a small word for a large thing. Walter Graves smiled. 5 months later, Diana Mercer was standing in the entrance to Terminal B at 6:47 in the morning, watching the day begin. She was wearing a jacket with a Horizon National badge and the quiet, settled authority of someone who has recently discovered that they were always going to end up in the position they are now, in that the path that looked like a detour was, in fact, the route. The training program had been hard in the ways she expected, and revelatory in the ways she hadn't. She had learned logistics, scheduling, conflict resolution, budget allocation, the practical architecture of making a large operation run smoothly. But what she had found most useful, and what her training coordinator had noted repeatedly in her evaluations with an almost confused admiration, was that Diana Mercer already knew the most important thing about the job before the job had taught it to her. She knew what it felt like to be the person the service was supposed to serve. Rosalind Mercer had come home from her most recent cardiology appointment with a report that was cautiously good medication was working, stress levels were manageable, the doctor was encouraged. Diana had visited twice during the training period, both times on the charter account that Walter had quietly arranged as part of her relocation package, and both times she had sat at her mother's kitchen table in Shreveport and eaten the food her mother cooked with the bone-deep relief of someone who had been eating alone in a studio apartment for too long. Rosalind had asked, with the careful, slightly amused skepticism of a woman who had raised a daughter she trusted, but also knew thoroughly whether any of this was real. Diana had laughed a real laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in a while, and said, "It's real, Mama." Rosalind had looked at her for a long time, and then said, "Well, that sounds right." The terminal filled up around Diana as the morning progressed, moving through the particular rhythms of an airport day, the early commuter flights, the business travelers, the families with strollers, navigating the space with the focused intensity of military operations, the elderly couple at Gate B4 who couldn't quite figure out the new self-service kiosk and were beginning to panic about their boarding time. She watched from the middle of the corridor as Marcus, one of her new staff, 22 years old, 3 months into his first job, earnest in a way that sometimes embarrassed him, noticed the couple before Diana had to say anything, watched him move toward them with a friendliness that was not performed, offer his assistance with the kiosk, and solve the problem in under 2 minutes, while the couple thanked him with the disproportionate relief of people who had been afraid of a small thing and found it resolved. Diana said nothing. She filed it away in the part of her that was learning to recognize, in the people she was responsible for, the same instinct she had been exercising her whole life without a name for it. She had spent the first months of the job doing two things in parallel: building the systems, the procedures, the protocols, the escalation paths, and building the culture, which was a harder and less quantifiable task. She had learned early that culture is not what you say it is. It is what happens in the moments that the procedure doesn't cover. It is what your people do when the right thing and the easy thing diverge, and no manager is present to make the call for them. She had been explicit about this with her team, in ways that made some of them briefly uncomfortable, and all of them, she believed, ultimately better at their jobs. She had told them, in the first all-hands meeting she ran, that the measure of this terminal's service was not the metrics on a dashboard, though the metrics mattered, but whether a person could walk through here on the worst day of their year and feel, at some point, that they had been seen. There had been a silence after she said it. Then, Marcus, sitting in the second row with the focused attention of someone trying to make a good impression on a new manager, had raised his hand and said, "Is that in the service guidelines?" And Diana had said, "It is now." By mid-morning, she had resolved a delayed baggage escalation, covered a staffing gap at the B12 information desk, and eaten a croissant standing up at the diner counter, the Blue Horizon, which still had the same kitchen staff, and had recently gotten a new general manager, who was, by all accounts, significantly less bad than Greg. She was standing near Gate B7, the gate, that gate, the one she passed every day with a private, complicated feeling that had softened over time, from loss into something more like context, when her phone buzzed with a message from Edward Park. It said simply, "Mr. Graves is in the terminal today. Didn't want to surprise you." She looked up from the phone, and there he was. Walter Graves was dressed, as he apparently always was when he moved through his own terminals, in ordinary clothes, dark trousers, a gray jacket that might have been the same one, a leather messenger bag that looked like it had been bought before. Leather messenger bags became fashionable and had not been replaced since. He was moving through the terminal with the careful, measured pace of a man who has recently had a compelling reason to pay attention to how his body is performing and who has decided, in response to this reason, to move through the world with slightly more deliberateness than before. He saw Diana the moment she saw him. His face did the same thing it had done in the hospital room, not quite a smile, but the unmistakable warmth of a specific recognition. He walked over to where she was standing, near Gate B7, and they stood together for a moment looking out at the tarmac, where 3 planes were in various stages of boarding and unboarding, tiny ground crew moving around them with the purposeful insignificance of people doing essential things at a scale that makes them invisible from a distance. "How's your mother?" Walter asked. "Better," Diana said. "Good days more than bad ones." He nodded with a satisfaction that was genuine and private, the satisfaction of a man who has done something useful and is not looking for acknowledgement of it. They watched a plane push back from the gate and begin its slow taxi toward the runway, gathering the unhurried momentum that eventually becomes the astonishing, improbable physics of flight. "I heard about the couple at B4 this morning," Walter said. "The kiosk." He glanced at her. "One of your people, Marcus," Diana said. "He's going to be good." Walter said, "Looks like it." There was a comfortable pause, the kind that exists between people who have moved past the point where silence requires filling. Then Walter said, "You know, When I started doing the rounds, I was looking for something I could identify and then replicate. A system, a training program, a set of behaviors you could teach. He watched another plane find its runway. It took me a long time to understand that the thing I was looking for wasn't a behavior. It was a person. He turned to look at Diana. And that once you have that person in the right position, you don't need to teach the behavior. You just need to get out of the way and let them build the culture. Diana looked at him. Is that what you did? She asked. Is that what it feels like? He laughed, a real one, the surprised, slightly rueful laugh of a man who has been accurately described. More or less, he said. They both looked back at the tarmac. She thought about the morning she had stood in this corridor with her suitcase and her resignation letter and the only $217 she had been able to accumulate in 18 months of disciplined, relentless saving. She thought about the sound of the announcement over the loudspeaker, the way it had cut through the terminal noise like a reminder that time was running out on something specific and irretrievable. She thought about the sound of a body meeting a floor, and the ring of 20 people doing nothing, and the 30 feet between where she was standing and where she needed to be. She thought about the choice that had not felt, in the moment, like a choice at all, because some choices, the real ones, the ones that determine something essential about who a person is, are not made by deliberation. They are made by the accumulated weight of everything you have ever believed and practiced and been, arriving at a single point in a single second, and moving your body before your mind has fully caught up. She had missed the flight she thought she needed. She had sat on a terminal floor and cried in silence for 7 minutes. She had gone to bed in a cold apartment with $83 and a phone full of unanswered messages and the unresolved question of whether she had done the right thing. And on the other side of all of that, on the other side of the grief and the loss and the long doubt of that night, was a morning that looked like this one. Marcus being good at his job by instinct, an elderly couple navigating a kiosk without fear, a terminal that was slowly, imperfectly, genuinely becoming the kind of place where people felt seen. The culture was not the policy. It was not the training program or the service guidelines or the badge. It was this, the accumulated, invisible, unremarkable effect of one person deciding, in a single unannounced moment, that a stranger's crisis was worth more than her own convenience. It spreads the way most real things spread, slowly and without a press release, and in ways that are difficult to measure and impossible to fully see. But it spreads. Diana Mercer stood at Gate B7 on an ordinary Wednesday morning and watched her terminal fill with ordinary people going to ordinary places and felt the particular, quiet satisfaction of someone who has discovered that the life they were supposed to be living was not, after all, the one they had planned for. It was better. It was harder in some ways, and better in the ways that mattered. And it had required her to give up the thing she was most afraid to lose in order to receive the thing she had never known to want. She had not chosen this. She had chosen, instead, something smaller and more immediate and more human. She had chosen to stop. She had chosen to kneel on a linoleum floor and hold the hand of a stranger and speak in a steady voice about ordinary things while a plane went south without her. Everything else, the job, the salary, the charter flights home, the badge, the morning, the culture, the future had followed from that single act of uncalculated human decency, the way water follows gravity, not because it was planned, but because it was the natural direction of a force that was always there. She missed the flight she thought she needed, and she boarded the future she never imagined.